Hi guys, it's Miss Sheehan. I hope you're having a good weekend or a good week now that you'll be seeing this. And today I'm going to do a lecture on how the Vietnam War was fought, looking mostly at how the Americans fought it, but then a little bit about how the Viet Cong specifically fought the war. So I'd like you to go ahead and take notes on this, and let's get into it. Okay, so to start off with, it's important to recognize that the Vietnam War was characterized by a couple of things. The first was that this primarily was what's called an asymmetric war or a lopsided war, right? It was the conventional military, the US in working together with the South Vietnamese military, fighting against both a smaller conventional military, North Vietnamese, and a guerrilla insurgency, which was the Viet Cong or VC. So that made it really difficult for the US to win. I mean, really, from the start, how do you win a guerrilla insurgency where where the fighters are amongst the people? It's not like you can just go and pick out, the guys in uniform and kill those guys, because by definition, guerrillas and people who fight in the insurgency don't wear uniforms and are of the people, right? So it's a difficult war to fight. And that really makes up a lot of the strategy that the US used in Vietnam. And then the second part is the wildly varying and very difficult geography of Vietnam, from mountains in the north to central jungle highlands with extremely thick jungle to the southern river delta. And a lot of the soldiers, the US soldiers, had never seen geography like this, and were extremely unprepared for it. So those are kind of the two big picture things that really characterize the war. But what we're going to talk about today is some of the smaller strategies. And I'd like to talk about these because I think these strategies are used continually by our military now, but especially both in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in other places. And these strategies all together kind of work together to make up a bigger picture of the American military, really in the 20th century post-World War II and the 21st century. Okay, so the strategies we're going to look at are bombing campaigns and air power, new types of weapons, search and destroy, hearts and minds, interrogation, and black operations. And by black operations, I mean secret operations, either secret operations run by the military or by like the CIA. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these. So probably the biggest advantage that the US had over both the VC and the NVA, the North Vietnamese, was our massive amounts of air power. And mostly what we did with that air power was bombing campaigns. So the Air Force in particular used extremely high altitude bombers with the ability to carry large amounts of bombs. And basically what they would do is they would go on a map and they would pick out mile-long boxes of territory and essentially just carpet those boxes with bombs. And that was to try and suppress both the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong. The Navy planes did more tactical bombing, like smaller targets like bridges or bases or schools or things like that, or camps where they knew the enemy was. So there was both these huge, large bombing campaigns and then also smaller bombing campaigns. And these went on throughout the war. The most famous bombing campaign was Operation Rolling Thunder, which started in 1964, right after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed. And this was kind of kicked off our mainstream involvement in the war. And it was a massive bombing campaign in the north. And throughout the war, the US also did bombing campaigns in both Cambodia and Laos, which you can see. You can't see Cambodia, but Cambodia is here on the bottom, and then Laos is next to Vietnam, both of which were supposed to be neutral countries, but we did actually both bomb, in the case of Cambodia, invade parts of Cambodia with the US military. And the extent of this was secret until very recently, when it's come out that we were much more involved in Cambodia and Laos than anyone at the time, besides really the military and the president, knew. Okay, the second huge advantage of air power was what's called air mobile or air mobile troops. So basically, we used helicopters to move troops or soldiers around to supply them with food and supplies and ammunition and to evacuate them. And this was a very big advantage because it meant you could pick up a set of troops, like a platoon or a company, and drop them off and then pick them back up again. And you didn't have to worry so much about like lines of support or logistics or things like that, because you could always just send out another helicopter with supplies or to pick them up if you needed them. The US also used a lot of different specialized helicopters as artillery support. Either they would be following with the troops on the ground and supporting them with their guns, like you can see here, right? This is probably a 50 caliber machine gun, or with specialized helicopters called gunships that carried lots of different types of weapons and missiles that could again support infantry patrols. And Vietnam is also when we had the advent of helicopter medevacs or medical evacuations, which meant that if a soldier was hurt on like a patrol, right, maybe not near a base, they could be picked up by the helicopter and taken directly to treatment, which really decreased the time from wound to treatment and dramatically increased the survival rate. And that's one of the reasons that the death toll, at least on the American side, was not much higher than it was. And also, this practice continues now and is one of the reasons that we do have such a low death toll for American wars now, is because we have this ability to go and pick up people who are severely wounded who might otherwise die and get them to treatment. Whereas like in World War II, we didn't really have that capability too much. Okay, so for new types of weapons, the US used sensors to detect troop movements, both like that they could bury in the ground and put on helicopters to like smell smoke and detect troops, so new types of technology. They used wiretaps, especially on the North Vietnamese, that they would like, it's not like where they could like beam back information now, but they would basically set up cassette recorders on telephones, and then they would be able to go and pick up those tapes and bring them back to get intelligence. And that was really a big, advantage, that we could use technology to get intelligence about what the enemy was doing. Landmines, which were not new, they had been used in several wars before, but they were widely used by both the US and the North Vietnamese and the Vietcong to devastating effect. And there are still probably hundreds of thousands of landmines in Vietnam, as well as Southeast Asia now, that just have never been decommissioned or exploded from the war. And cluster bombs, which are like bunch of smaller bombs connected together, and then they can like release at different times, and they were usually used to destroy people or vehicles. They're now actually banned, and most countries consider it a war crime to use cluster bombs because how devastating they are. And then probably the two most famous things from the Vietnam War, Agent Orange and napalm, which I'll talk about in the next slide here. So Agent Orange was a defoliant, a deforesting chemical. And it was basically used to remove unwanted foliage, trees and plants, which provided cover for the enemy. And literally they would just load up planes with this, and then like they spray pesticides, they would spray it across the forests and the jungle. Approximately 20 million gallons were used in Vietnam. And the exposure, of course, as you would expect with a chemical like this, causes harm both to the Vietnamese people who it was sprayed on and the US soldiers who were there who got the after effects. Not only is there a risk of cancer if you are exposed to it, but it also can cause genetic defects. So like a lot of children were born with like what's called hydrocephaly, which is like an enlarged head or lack of limbs and things like that. And there's actually like people are still uncovering the extent to which Agent Orange damaged people and children in Vietnam today. And then napalm, which was probably the most famous and devastating weapon of the war. And napalm is essentially jellied gasoline. It's a flammable liquid that can stick to stuff. And it was primarily used to clear helicopter landing zones. So basically they would drop a bunch of napalm, it would light on fire, and it would burn down an area. And it is also was used as an anti-personnel weapon. It was used against people. And it's a really horrifying thing to do to someone because it burns at really high temperatures and will literally burn your skin off. So it's a very horrific way to kill someone, much more horrific than being shot, I might say. And so this picture down here at the bottom is a very famous picture of children running from napalm in the background. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is search and destroy. Search and destroy was the primary infantry strategy that was used in Vietnam. This is mostly what the American soldiers who were on the ground really did. And essentially they would either walk or were flown via helicopter out to suspected enemy locations to set up ambushes, basically to try to lure the enemy, whether that was the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong, into an ambush where they could then kill them. That was, a side note, pretty demoralizing to soldiers because they felt like they were being used like just as bait, and they didn't really have any power over whether or not the enemy would come to them. And this was also used in tandem with what was called pacification, where they would move civilians from enemy controlled areas to camps, essentially, or to like non-combatant villages, and then create what was called a free fire zone. And in these free fire zone, the normal rules about who you can and cannot kill as a soldier were suspended. And basically the US military said anyone who is in that free fire zone, now that it has been pacified, is considered military and you can kill them. And that resulted in a lot of civilian deaths and a lot of atrocities by the US, because you can imagine if you're a soldier and your commander says anyone you see is going to try to kill you is an enemy, right? You're going to want to shoot them first. You're not going to stand there and ask questions about it. So that was a really devastating policy, both for the soldiers who committed the atrocities and for obviously the people of Vietnam. Search and destroy wasn't super successful for several reasons. One is that it killed many innocent civilians, and this actually created a lot of increased opposition to the US presence in Vietnam, and would make the Vietnamese people maybe more willing to either let the Viet Cong into their villages or into their areas that they previously hadn't been let into, and to maybe even join the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese themselves. So it's kind of like the opposite effect that the US wanted by killing all of these supposed enemies, right? They were actually driving people into the arms of Vietnam. And this is very similar to what happened in like Iraq and Afghanistan, where by killing people we thought were participating in anti-US activity, we were actually creating more. And like this is where like ISIS came from and stuff like that. And it was a broader tactical failure as well. The North Vietnamese army was willing to endure a lot of losses. They were in it for the long haul, right? It was their home. They were basically saying, we'll do what it takes. And also it was really hard for the US military to identify the Viet Cong, right? They're not wearing a uniform. The majority of the soldiers couldn't speak Vietnamese. They couldn't talk to them. And so they didn't know who was or wasn't fighting against them. Okay, along with search and destroy went hearts and minds. And hearts and minds was basically like the opposite of search and destroy. It was to try and win over the Vietnamese people to the South Vietnamese non-communist side. And so soldiers, when they were not doing search and destroy, they went out on what were called CAPs, civilian action patrols. And that was basically where they would bring water, food, humanitarian aid to villages they felt were friendly and try to basically get them to stay on the US side. And they also provided a lot of security from Vietcong taxation, right? Like a lot of villagers were forced to turn over their crops to supply the Viet Cong. So the US would try to protect the villagers from that. Of course, in the balance with search and destroy and being killed, right? You know, like they were kind of working at cross purposes. There were also programs that encouraged Viet Cong members or North Vietnamese soldiers to surrender to the US. And you could do that without like being worried that you would be put in jail or killed, stuff like that. Okay, and then the last tactic was interrogation and black ops, or secret operations. And this was the primary one in Vietnam, was run by the CIA, and this was called Operation Phoenix, which began in 1965 and ran throughout the war. And basically, this was a program run by the CIA where they would interrogate, torture, and then kill suspected Viet Cong members, completely without oversight, um, and using methods that were not used by the military. So this was basically, Congress actually later called it a state-sponsored murder program, right? And so it might not, wasn't always people who were in the Viet Cong. A lot of times they were suspected, and then they would, confess under torture, as you do, and then they were murdered. So later there were actually congressional hearings into this program. But this was really an attempt by the CIA and by the US to punish civilians who were joining the Viet Cong and things like that. Okay, so on the other side of this were the Viet Cong, right? The Viet Cong were fighting what's called a guerrilla war. And that was where, like, instead of doing conventional military things where you would go out and have like a big battle with tanks and infantry and, helicopters and planes and stuff, you would basically want to attack the US where it was. And so they would do that by ambushing US patrols. They would set booby traps and landmines. They planted bombs in towns they knew the US was going to patrol, and they would mingle in with the peasants. And often they were peasants, right? They would just, pick up and take a gun and go out and fight. So it was very hard for the US to identify who was Viet Cong. The Viet Cong was primarily supplied with weapons and money by both China and the Soviet Union. And one of the things they did was use what was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. So they would get like supplies and weapons from North Vietnam and China and the Soviet Union, and then move them down through Laos and Cambodia here into more South Vietnam. And that was like the justification for the US going into Cambodia and Laos, and attacking these otherwise neutral countries, was that the Viet Cong was using it as supply routes, essentially. So Viet Cong often used landmines and booby traps, primarily because they were cheap and effective. And so literally like booby traps, like stakes in a pit, right? And then landmines that are very hard to see. And these really terrorized a lot of US soldiers, right? Because they didn't know what was coming. They were hard to see, and a lot of people were injured and killed in this way. They also used tunnels, and so you can see that's how big the tunnels were, like literally just the width of a person. But the tunnels were not just for moving around or for waiting to attack, right? They were also where the Viet Cong would like live and meet. So this is actually from your textbook, right? They were huge complexes of tunnels literally underground with supply catches and first aid stations and sleeping quarters and things like that. So the Viet Cong were able to live, a lot of them, underground, completely undetected by the US, right? They had wells, right? False tunnels, kitchens, all these different things. Okay, and then just to wrap up, so maybe the most famous battles or set of battles of the war was called the Tet Offensive, which started on January 30th, 1968 and went for about 6 months to June 8th, 1968. And it was a series of North Vietnam and Viet Cong offensives on South Vietnamese targets. And it was called the Tet Offensive because it started during the Tet holiday, which is the Vietnamese New Year. And really it was meant by the North Vietnamese to spark a popular uprising, that should say South Vietnam, in South Vietnam, to get the South Vietnamese to join the North Vietnamese side. The US and the South Vietnamese managed to hold back a lot of the attacks and actually keep some of the territory that was attacked, but the huge scale of the offensives and the huge amounts of casualties for the US contributed extremely to the US anti-war movement. And the 1968 was really kind of the turning year for the anti-war movement back home, which we'll look at tomorrow. And it was really a strategic victory for the North Vietnamese. It was the kind of marked the high point of American military supremacy. And really after Tet and after the Tet Offensive, it was really the beginning of the end. And actually Johnson started peace talks as early as 1968, although of course it took until 1973 for the war to end. But the Tet really showed how dedicated and how powerful both the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were, and how much they could defeat what was supposed to be one of the strongest militaries in the world, the American military. Okay, that is it. As always, you can ask me any questions in Teams or via email, and I hope you guys are doing well. Bye.